Welcome to the Chief of Cybersecurity podcast, where we discuss relevant information concerning the cybersecurity workforce, business development, and best practices, made possible by CMIS. Learn more at cmis.net. And for a list of authorized publications, visit DewayneHart.com. And now, here's your host, Dewayne Hart.
Good morning, good afternoon, good weekend. I don't know what time it is, but if you're listening to my podcast, I appreciate you coming on board. So this podcast session is dedicated to something very important. It's something that we all hear a lot. You know, that's a term called the cloud. And cloud technologies has pretty much in some fashion been around for a bit. But the technology industry had made better use of cloud services over the past 10 years. Now, there are some old school technology people that have been a part of IT ever since the 1980s, 1990s, and some that have been part of technology since the 70s. And during those particular times, there was something we used called dummy terminals. A dummy terminal was a screen and a keyboard that was attached to a mainframe computer, and you did not have a hard drive. So when I think of the cloud environment, it kind of takes me back to those days, because you never owned the large mainframe computer. Now, with the cloud environment, it follows some of the same concepts, because if you look at the cloud environment and you think about some of the services that are being offered, it really makes our life simple. Here's a prime example of how we can relate cloud. Everyone has cable at home, maybe Cox Cable, maybe AT&T, right? When you purchase a subscription, you can upscale and downscale your services. You don't own any of the equipment. You just use the service. Now take that same concept and transition that over to the cloud environment. So in the cloud environment, organizations and users do not really own any of the equipment that they're using, and they don't own the software. They just use it, and they pay a subscription fee. Now, the beauty of that is that you don't have to worry about going through and doing all the updates, worrying about equipment failure, because the cloud service provider is going to take care of that for you. There are some familiar type of cloud service providers out there. You have Amazon Web Service, and you have Azure, which is sponsored by Microsoft. So in this podcast session, we're going to be focusing on cybersecurity aspects of the cloud. But in order to make it very functional, in order to make it very interesting, we're going to have to start off at the bottom. And starting off at the bottom means that the focus is on the cloud environment and looking at the way it's shaped, looking at the way the cloud environments are configured, looking at some of the advantages of the cloud, and then transition that into the cybersecurity connectors. And once we connect it to cybersecurity, that's when we want to pull out some of those risks and then identify some of the protection standards that need to be in place. Sounds like fun? Well, let's get started here. The cloud environment. So the cloud environment itself is set up like an apartment complex. Okay. Imagine that you have 100 tenants that are in an apartment complex, right? And those tenants do not own that apartment complex. They just pay rent so they can stay there. Now, between each tenant, there's a wall, okay? I stay in 101, you stay in 102. And then that wall serves up as an isolation barrier. And that same concept applies to the cloud environment because you have these large data centers. And at these large data centers, there are thousands of servers that are allocated for use because a cloud service provider may have, I would say, 1 million customers. Now, speaking of a cloud service provider, that is the person or the organization that actually owns the cloud that you are paying the subscription fee from. And for instance, if you were looking at your television and if you bought a subscription service from AT&T, then AT&T would be the cloud service provider. All right. Now, there are some functional pieces that go along with the cloud. One is that the cloud itself reduces cost. It reduces costs on the end of the cloud service provider because they don't have to be sending people out to do all the maintenance repairs and all the updates because they can do that in-house. Now, there are 3 different type of architects that you have for the cloud because you have infrastructure as a service, you have platform as a service, and you have software as a service. All right. When you look at infrastructure as a service, it's just saying, okay, I am going to rent out my infrastructure equipment to you. You own the software. You think about the servers, you think about the firewalls, the switches, and so forth. And if you're using AWS, it's called an EC2. Platform as a service is just set up where there's a platform so that individuals can develop software codes. Software as a service means that you only really pay a subscription fee to use the software only, okay? And the maintenance is done by the cloud service providers. And there are plenty of SaaS type of environments that are available as well. Some of the other parts is that the cloud technology allows both organizations and individuals to be more efficient because you have faster access to information because you don't have to worry about maintenance because the cloud service provider is taking care of the maintenance for you. And availability is very important too because the cloud is always up and operating. Now, in a cloud environment, there are different ways of using the cloud itself. There's a lot of organizations that actually go to the cloud because they have a dispersed group of users, and also too because it costs so much to have equipment. If you think about Macy's, right? During the Christmas season, there's an growth in sales because it's the Christmas season. Imagine Macy's saying, okay, I got 100 servers that is located in my data warehouse over here. But for Christmas season, I need to have 200. So imagine Macy's going out and purchasing those 200 servers. And then when the Christmas season is over with, the servers are not used. So wouldn't it be wise to go to a cloud service provider and just go to the cloud and say, I need to buy a subscription where I can use 100 servers for the Christmas season? Okay. And you use it for the Christmas season. And when the Christmas season is over with, you downscale. Now, you only spent a subscription fee for the Christmas season. So you don't have no physical servers after that. This is one of the importance of the cloud environment. Okay. So speaking of the importance of the cloud environment, let's just move into some of the advantages that we can endure out of the cloud environment. For security and privacy, it's going to give you a safe, secure, and a private network. All right. When I roll through some of these advantages of the cloud, think about some of the traditional ways of using cybersecurity because they do apply to the cloud. You know, the only difference is that a lot of the technology, equipment, and software are not owned by companies or an individual. They are owned by a cloud service provider. So security still stays in place. Speed and power is very important because you have faster access to information in your network because of the uptime. Scalability is very, very important because you can tailor the cloud environment, because you can upscale and you can downscale, just like I explained about Macy's, right? Because you upscale during the Christmas season and you downscale when the Christmas season is over. Flexibility, which means for that typical accessible from any location. That means you can have employees that travel from Atlanta, maybe to Miami, and they still have access to the cloud environment. And it makes no difference where your company is dispersed, you still have access to the cloud environment. Imagine if you had a data center that was located in the city of Los Angeles, but you had employees that were in New York. Well, you got to link that data center over. Well, if you go to the cloud, then you don't have to link it because you have automatic access to those infrastructure devices or software that you're using. Usability is very important too, because it's user-friendly and access can be gained quickly. These are some of the advantages of the cloud environment. One of the major environments is total cost of ownership, because you're saving money now because you don't own any of the equipment. And when you don't own the equipment, then you can focus more so on operations and try to maintain your customer base and to make sure that your customers stay happy. Now, if your customers are happy, so that means that you have cybersecurity in place as well. So let's talk about the cybersecurity connectors. One out of the top is data. All right. Data is very important because in the cloud environment, there may be some customers' data that is stored on those servers. Now, this is where your service level agreements come in place. And your service level agreements come in place because someone's supposed to be responsible for like maintaining the uptime of those particular services. Also, too, you can have operational level agreements as well, too, and privacy level agreements, because you have to have those in place because there's a relationship between an organization and the cloud service provider. If you don't have those agreements in place, then it could become a legal issue if there's something like data spillage or if it's a breach. Some of the other factors that you get out of the cloud environment is pretty much encryption as well, too, because you have to encrypt data. Threats, some of the common threats that you get out of a cloud environment is maybe someone can gain access to a database in a cloud environment, and they can gather that information and use it just like they would on a local LAN network. One of the most important things is availability too. All right. So we know that in the cybersecurity community, when it comes to availability, systems are supposed to stay up 99% of the time. This is a cybersecurity connector in the cloud environment. Is that the cloud service provider always makes sure that the system is available and online 99% of the time. Patching is one of the other features too, because if you're working in AWS, if you use certain services like Inspector or your Security Hub, Guard Duty, CloudTrail, those are going to help you do your patching and your remediation, because Amazon Inspector is designed to do a vulnerability scan. Just like you would have on-site application like Tenable Nexus that you use to do a vulnerability scan, well, AWS Inspector does a vulnerability scan as well too. And it will show you the vulnerabilities that you have on your different instances. Let's say, for instance, an EC2. And EC2 is nothing more than a server. Okay, so I want to make that known because some of the terms I use for the cloud are relatable to a traditional LAN environment. Now, these are some of the connectors that you have. One of the things that I always like to bring up is that who is responsible for data in the cloud? Okay. That is a question that arises, and that can be settled between the organization and the cloud service provider. But ultimately, the one that collects that data is the first person that held responsible. Let's say, for instance, if you have customers, and let's say that you collect data for your customers, but the information is stored in the cloud environment, you, as the organization, has a direct relationship with your customers, and you're held responsible for it, unless there's an agreement or something signed that states that you cannot hold yourself responsible for data that is collected and held in the cloud environment. Now, there is a relationship between you as a company and the cloud service provider as well, too. Now, this is where your operation level agreements and your privacy level agreements and your service level agreements come in place. One of the key features is to making sure that there is some type of agreement in place as well, too. Because if you're a company, you want to make sure that the cloud service provider follows the same security principles as you would. So that means that if you're having an audit, and if it's a certain standard that you use for your audits, you want to make sure that the cloud service provider is following the same standard. Now, that is something that has to be worked out between an organization and a cloud service provider. So let's just talk about some of the risks that are imposed in a cloud environment. So I always like to state that, and I'll repeat this again, is that some of the risks that you gather from a traditional environment is still relatable to the cloud environment. One out the door is privacy. Right? Privacy is very important because you're in a shared environment. When I speak of a shared environment, it's like the tenants, where there's this apartment complex, and there's 100 people that stay in this apartment complex. And so you have apartment 101, 102, 103, 104, and 101 has information that 102 do not need to know. So that's where isolation comes to play a key role. And usually the walls between each apartment complex serves as a barrier. One of the other factors is compliance for audit, storage, location, and notification, because there are compliance standards that you have to have for the cloud environment. If you don't have these compliance standards in place, then security will fail itself. One of the other features is ownership. Somebody has to take ownership for the data. Somebody has to take ownership for cybersecurity itself. I would say that from my personal experience in working with various organizations, there still is kind of a confusing state about who has ownership and who's responsible for taking care of what tasks, initiatives, or protecting data in the cloud environment. I think that can be easily remediated if an organization lays it down through an agreement. But likewise, I would say it again, I think that I still see a lot of organizations have a challenge in understanding who is responsible for a certain piece of information in the cloud environment. Spillage is another factor too. Think about spillage as not so much as something that is pouring out of a cup, but when you look at those protected barriers and the isolation that you have in place, when it's a lapse and that information from tenant 101 spills over into tenant 102. Now, these are some of the risks that you have to deal with in the cloud environment. This is why you have certain security controls in place to make sure that spillage do not exist. Some of the other factors that you have on a traditional network, you still have to practice those on a cloud environment, because you still have a set of controls that should be in place. When it comes to data sharing, where you have to limit the data sharing. When it comes to identity management, that is still a factor that you have to consider in the cloud environment as well too, because before you authenticate someone to have used to certain software and also infrastructure in the cloud environment, a person has to be given authorization. And there are some services that you have for identity management for these cloud service providers like AWS and Azure itself. Some of the other features, too, is that digital modernization plays a key role in cloud security as well, too. Because although the cloud is available, it may not work for every organization. Because every organization has to take a look at their current environment and see whether it's great use for you or not. Over in the cybersecurity mindset, under chapter 17, there's a write-up about digital modernization. And in that particular area, I discuss how organizations should do an assessment prior to migrating to the cloud environment. Part of that assessment is to see how security operates if you transition to the cloud environment. But also, too, is to look at the cost. Is it really feasible for an organization to transfer to the cloud? Or should the organization wait 2, maybe 3 years and transfer to the cloud? See, there's a lot of feasibility studies that have to go on before you transition to the cloud. Now, I'm not here to say that every organization is at failure if they don't go to the cloud, but you have to think about whether it's benefits your company or not. Now, even end users that have certain applications and tools that they buy for the cloud, is it really serving a great need for them to transfer to the cloud environment for like certain usage? Is it really just better off just to have a laptop at home with a software application that you can use? Part of that is doing a feasibility study. Besides all of that, what I just stated, there's still a responsibility for protecting the cloud. So to protect the cloud, here's exactly what actually needs to happen. Understand your shared responsibility model. There's a shared responsibility model that states if you're in the cloud environment, you're going to be sharing information, but who is responsible for information that is being shared? And also, too, before you share information, then you have to go through the process of what you're sharing, why is it that you need to share it, and who you're sharing it to, and when do you need to share it to, all right? In the cybersecurity mindset, there's a model I created, which is called the information sharing framework. And it brings this same discussion into attention here because when you're sharing information on a traditional LAN environment, the same concept applies to the cloud environment. Here goes some others too. Ask your cloud provider detailed security questions. You have to ask questions because you don't know if they carry the same security mindset as your organization do. Deploy an identity and access management solution. Yes, you still have to have that in place because you can't happen to build an open access environment because for the cloud environment itself, individuals have to be authenticated. Train your staff. Straightforward. Establish and enforce cloud security policy. Yes, because you need to have policies in place for the cloud as you would the on-prem environment. Some other is to secure your endpoints because you have endpoints, which is your desktop, laptops, and so forth. All right, because you have to make sure that they are secured as well too. If you're looking at an EC2, which is a server, well, you got to make sure that it's secured in the cloud environment. Double check your compliance requirement. Very important again, because compliance is very important and you need to make sure that your compliance environment is set up appropriately. Enable security logs. You can't get away from that. AWS has a feature and some services that can help you out as well too, like CloudTrail. If you into learning more about some of the protection standards that need to be in place, there's a NIST reference model out there, which is 17788, which is one can be used as well too. The NIST framework has also established some cloud type of security controls that are in place. There are some organizations that actually go through FedRAMP. FedRAMP is the government standard for the compliance that should be in place for cloud environments like GovCloud. And to protect the cloud, still keep in mind that some of the type of standards you have in the traditional LAN environment, you have to transition those to the cloud environment as well, because it doesn't change, because you just don't give away your environment, because you still have to maintain your situation awareness. This is kind of one of the laps in the problems I've seen in the past, is that we're going to the cloud and people relax and get back a little bit and say the cloud service provider is supposed to take care of that. No matter how someone may purchase services from the cloud service provider, you still have to remain vigilant, and you still have to have that risk-based attitude in place. Because when you have a risk-based attitude in place, you become a human firewall. You say, okay, I know we're in the cloud environment, but still we need to work on and to make sure that we stay protected. All right. So here's some things to consider. Despite the challenge, the cloud is still viable. Okay. The cloud has a reason to serve technology and it's doing well, but underneath the fabric of a cloud environment, cybersecurity exists, and having that risk-based attitude still needs to be in place. As of now, there's one improvement I think that could make the cloud better, is just to have a cultural shift. A cultural shift is saying, okay, then, instead of having this attitude about we have a cloud service provider to go and take care of everything, have that risk-based attitude, say, okay, although that's in place, we need to stand the way we look at business for the cloud environment, and to realize that we just don't throw our environment away. Because when you throw that environment away, all right, what you are creating is pretty much an environment where you're stating that risks do not exist, right? And if you're saying that risks do not exist, then you have built what I call the zero risk mentality. All right. So in this next episode 3, we're going to be talking about the zero risk mentality.
You've been listening to the Chief of Cybersecurity podcast, where you have gained relevant knowledge to enhance your cybersecurity mindset. Be sure to visit DewayneHart.com to learn more about authored publications, show notes, and discover more information concerning cybersecurity.